The Inferno Within. The next morning, it wasn't any later than 8 in the morning when Montano and his nearly depleted Century were packed up and ready to go. His men spent the better part of the morning gathering water from a small stream in the wilderness, and all the tent supplies were loaded on their poles in line with his soldiers awaiting the order to proceed south. Montano did his last checks around the place of prior encampment and looked across the highway to see the enormous force under the Interfector's banner was also mostly ready to begin marching in the opposite direction. The massive force stretched nearly a mile long, and Montano's tiny brigade still looked like a pathetic excuse for a formation of Caesar's servants. He'd watched each of the chariots roar to life throughout the morning and take their places along the road, but somewhere before his unit was all packed up, he noticed that 4 of the vehicles hadn't moved from the field. Montano saw as a crew from the Interfector's force came over to the resting vehicles and began working on them. For the past 30 minutes before Montano's unit was ready to go, he saw the soldiers still working on the terrifying machines as he took his place at the head of his tiny formation, taking a look at the road south and hearing the distant engines of those idling war carts. He finally looked back at the 4 broken vehicles in the middle of the field and noticed the identifying plume of a centurion's helmet overseeing the repair work. With one last look at the road south, he saw 2 different centuries snaking around the idling chariots and continuing north. He saw that 3 weeks' march just to Mesa Verde and the probable 4 weeks back, imagining what terror he'd feel and receive for missing out on the siege of Denver. Though he knew he'd likely be there for the final assault, every day he missed out on in siege was a missed chance to serve and bring glory to Caesar. At last, Montano brought his hands up to his gifted steel face mask, felt the large chip in the lower right side, and turned to his senior. "Falco, wait here. We will be joining this force up to Denver." Falco saluted, gave a signal to the force to rest in place, and Montano proceeded across the field to the broken vehicles and the officer in charge of the Interfector's battle group. As Montano approached, his mind swarmed, not in an anxious way, just in a way that attempted to pinpoint the quickest means of obtaining what he needed. When Aileron was within 50 yards of Montano, the commander of the 32nd had landed on a reasonable cause for approach. He had the entire conversation planned out in his mind that would simply ask Aileron for the specific location of his Primus. Montano figured he would obtain the information and dispatch a runner or Falco to quickly head up the line and make the request from Lord Interfector himself. With such a simple demand, the conversation with his rival would be no more than a minute, and no fighting would delay his mission further. Not more than 30 yards from the man, Montano heard and saw one of the vehicles spark to life and immediately begin chugging slowly towards the highway between Aileron and himself. Montano saw Aileron's head follow the vehicle as the man stayed in place while Montano continued his advance. The vehicle passed before Montano, who paid no mind to it, even as he was wrapped in the black cloud it made. As the chariot proceeded on, Montano emerged from the cloud and saw his rival had turned his attention back to the other 3 vehicles under repair. Montano stopped when he was no more than 10 yards from Aileron and could not find the words as he looked at the long gold-lined cape on Aileron's back. Montano considered the state of his own that was more ragged, burnt, and frayed than any he'd ever seen. The gold on his own had long since been burnt off, and even his mask felt like it wasn't a gift from the Legatus Imperialis, but a scrap of garbage he'd fashioned to emulate one of the legate's favored. Even Montano's uniform and the new sweater he wore somehow deteriorated in the night to match the rest of his ashy and blood-stained self. Finally, Montano looked at the vehicles past his rival and the crews working on them as he said, "Such fine vehicles Lord Kaiser has here. I haven't seen these since Phoenix." Aileron knew the voice without even turning to see who it was, and hearing that voice again made Aileron's blood boil only for a split second before immediately cooling in the Colorado breeze. Aileron turned around, not seeing the man first, but seeing the absence of a centurion head at the distant crippled century he noticed earlier. Aileron's eyes landed on the man who said those words. Standing no more than 10 paces before him was Centurion Montano, standing there in his gifted mask, and nearly covered head to toe in dried blood, dirt, ash, and morning dew. Aileron saw Montano's uniform and armor was dented, cracked, and torn beyond belief. His armor and state wasn't a unique sight along the meat grinder, but for the first time in too long, Aileron considered how he looked to soldiers out here. The fan of red atop Montano's helmet was in a sorry half-burned state, and the fine mask he gifted the man nearly 5 years earlier had the lower third of its right side chipped off. Upon meeting the eyes behind the mask, Aileron watched Montano remove the mask from his helmet as the blood-covered officer said, "I thought that was you, Centurion Aileron." I couldn't quite tell from the distance, but with his rival now facing him, Montano got an even better look at the man's apparel. With his mask removed, Montano almost couldn't stop himself from gazing in near awe at the pristine condition of Aileron's attire. The steel of his cuirass and shoulder guards nearly glistened even in the overcast atmosphere, and the leather torso guard was polished almost completely black, save for the iron studs along each strip. Montano felt his sleeves were rolled partially up, and the burns and scars on his arms were even more visible. Before Montano could get lost in envying his rival's uniform even more, his mouth spoke for him. "What a fine uniform you're wearing." Not intending to say anything unnecessary to the reason he was there, Montano stopped himself, and then began again with another intention to remind Aileron that cordiality was possible between them. Montano quickly added, "It's been so long since we served side by side, hasn't it, Centurion Aileron?" For good measure, he also added quickly, "It's an honor to see you in the Colorado wilderness." Aileron continued to look over Montano as he raised a fist to his heart, prompting Montano to do the same as Aileron replied, "It is an honor to see you too, Centurion Montano." "How's Clara and Raquel?" Montano answered. "Clara remains back at the homestead north of Gallup, and Raquel is there behind my staff." He went to point to his depleted sentry by the highway, but didn't turn his head upon noticing a few of the engineers looking up from their work at he and Aileron. Aileron returned with a simple, "That's excellent to hear," as his attention too was drawn more towards something else. Almost all of the eyes in Montano's sentry were looking their direction, and he even noticed that the sentries marching up the meat grinder were all seemingly looking at them as they passed. Though the passing units were too far to truly say for sure, both men continued to feel like there were over 1,000 eyes on them. Finally, the focus of both men landed on each other again, and Aileron felt even more suspicious about why Montano approached in the first place. Montano felt equally disturbed by all the eyes on him, but he still only approached Aileron for one reason alone. A reason he couldn't seem to remember as he felt those eyes and looked upon his rival's uniform. In an effort to possibly jog his memory, Montano asked plainly, "How goes regional control over the elite's praetorship?" Aileron almost squinted in suspicion, but knew that facial expressions were something that not only showed weakness, but also led to unnecessary conflict. As Aileron wished he had a mask, he found himself answering Montano's question. There remains a guerrilla war in northwest Arizona with the Desert Rangers. Auxilias continue their reluctance to offer tribute as well, and there's currently some issues with townships as reserve garrisons diminish in the meat grinder. There was. Montano remembered the reason he approached Aileron. "I worry for our forces since the problems under the praetor's control sound tenuous," said Montano, remembering he needed replenishment forces, and the logistical problems in the Interfector's jurisdiction needed remedy. Upon realizing what he said and how it wasn't beneficial towards obtaining the Interfector's whereabouts, Montano went to correct himself, but Aileron responded first in his calm demeanor. "There is little to worry about, Centurion Montano. With the end of this front, regional stability will resume. Holding the territory, however, is just more difficult with the particular drain this front is causing." Was that an ill statement against the Eastern Front? Montano thought for a second. Victory across the East was no reason for a lack of adaptability on the part of those leading logistical administration. Again, before Montano could realize that these thoughts in no way benefited his goal, he found himself saying, "I can assure you that it truly is no picnic here in Colorado, Centurion Aileron. The front needs competence in logistical administration in order to progress." Surely Centurion Montano did not just tell me how to do my job, thought Aileron. There's no way he came over to me to provoke a fight again, Aileron thought still. Aileron finally concluded that he would narrow in on the reason for approach, since it obviously wasn't a fight. After all, Aileron briefly recalled the warm remark from his rival about his uniform on introduction, so clearly, he intended peace. Unless that remark was a subtle insult about my position at Circle Junction away from the meat grinder, Aileron again thought. with only the smallest measurable amount of rage boiling. Aileron decided to stay true and focus in on the reason for Montano's approach. Although Aileron needed to correct Montano's statement first, so he said, "Competence is not an issue, Montano. Although I can assure you that the campaign's logistics, even this far from Circle Junction, is not the impediment, so much as the particular tactics and pace requiring such soldier demand on this end of the front. However, I understand your concerns. Given what I've seen in status reports following each battle, I see the style of warfare Caesar's enemies employ and what remedy is required." That seemed peaceful enough, thought Aileron. At the same time, Montano thought, did Aileron claim to understand what it's like here in Colorado just by reading reports? With all thoughts of returning to the reason about to begin their sprint into the meat grinder, Montano asked as calmly as he could, "You understand the enemies out here?" Again, this was said as cordially as Montano could muster, even as he said, "Then surely you understand that the tactics implemented by so many enemies in this land are only defeated by the most vicious and merciless of assaults ordered by the authority of Caesar and his esteemed subordinate on this front. Lord Caesar, and the Centurion Carnifex in particular, are relying on replacements to be readily available when needed, especially with the fall of Denver fast approaching." Aileron almost marveled at the fact that this man came over to him to offer instruction on how to do his job better. Aileron was excellent in his duties, and last thing he wanted was to get a lecture from a man who couldn't do half of the things he did to support the Legion daily. "The kinds of problems I deal with are not the ones you can just swing a blade at," Aileron thought as he said. "Those replacements are available, and supply is moving up the line at all hours since the start of the campaign. Mesa Verde remains our anchor in this land, a place that is currently almost at capacity for soldiers to replenish battered sentries." Ha ha, Montano thought. He admitted it. It's Aileron's fault that Montano is having to make the 3-week march just to get replenishment forces from Mesa Verde. Just before realizing he didn't have to make that trip after acquiring the whereabouts of Lord Interfector, Montano interrupted Aileron. "An excellent word to hear, Aileron, but being this far from Mesa Verde is rather limiting to the progress of the campaign when it's moving faster than logistics can apparently keep up." Montano at least found some comfort in the calm delivery of his words. But before anything else, Aileron said, "Do not interrupt me, Montano." Then immediately Aileron resumed, "Outposts and resupply points are at equal intervals along the line, so I can only enforce my position that the tactical mind of commanders like Carnifex would better be oriented towards preservation of legionaries when possible. I must still admit that I don't see how bettering the movement of troops and supplies could prevent something like the state of your unit. What exactly happened to your sentry anyway?" "That is my concern, Aileron. My unit is merely in need of replenishment before rejoining Laenius in Denver." Montano wondered why the hell in Caesar's name that this man would ever need to know what kind of battles the 32nd had gone through. Then it occurred to him again that gaining replenishments from the Interfector's force was the reason he approached in the first place. When Montano was done, both were tense, and Aileron asked, "Rejoining? But what could have happened this close to the highway to Denver? Which enemy has been neglected in order to cause such a diminishment of your century?" Montano was tired, and again forgot the reason he was there after hearing another slew of words from that man. Montano said plainly, "I tire of your questions, Centurion Aileron. However, I will tell you, since you're about to finally join this front under the leadership of Carnifex, that war under him moves very fast. Sometimes when you're so busy killing one enemy, you are blind to another." "I don't follow," said Aileron, beginning to wonder even more about the reason Montano was talking to him. Montano explained, "My cohort under Laenius was sent to destroy the backstabbing tribe erased immediately before he moved to Denver. The tribe erased was bigger than the Guerreros, but fell in 1/8 the time under his leadership. Though my century fought valiantly, some ill-trained New Mexican conscripts of the 48th under Centurion, name erased from history, fell back. And despite the victory, Carnifex ordered the decimation of the entire cohort." "How could that be, especially if you won the day? Decimation is so rarely done," asked Aileron, more interested in the situation than even he thought he'd be. Montano answered, but not before feeling something of a new sense of pride in his battered appearance. "Perhaps you truly have been too far from the front, because Carnifex takes no amount of failure in the pace of this campaign." At that, Aileron briefly looked himself over. He noticed the shining state of his armor and intact uniform in a way that he didn't think would happen. Montano felt Aileron's look and felt even more pride in his own disgusting uniform than earlier, knowing that he was now the envy of the man before him. Feeling like he'd won, whatever this was, Montano's world was thrown into a confusing spiral once more when his rival smacked him over the head with the reason for approach. Aileron said in a casual manner, "I see. Well, you can petition Lord Interfector for replenishments of your decimated unit." In that simple sentence, Montano immediately went from that feeling of triumph to a feeling of defeat. This feeling wasn't because of his rival being the one to suggest the replacement, but because of Aileron's use of the word decimated. Sure, Montano had used the word because that is part of what happened to his unit. However, Aileron had seemingly ignored the part where Montano's forces fought valiantly. Aileron's words made it seem like Montano was in need of replenishments because of that decimation reason alone, which was something that put any notion of concluding the matter in the furthest part of his mind. Aileron felt the same way. His offer was not intended to insult Montano, but it was always destined to one way or another. After a silent moment, one of the chariots kicked on. The engine whirred to life and moved slowly to a spot beside Aileron and Montano. The pilot lowered his mask and shouted to Aileron over the whir of the engine, "Centurion Aileron, shall I?" But the soldier was cut off by the raise of Aileron's hand. The chariot idled beside the two, and Aileron looked back to Montano, asking, "Does that suit you, Montano? Shall I have the Interfector bolster your—" Montano shouted over the engine, "Take one of these chariots." "All right." Montano heard what was really asked, but he also knew what he was doing as he looked over the rumbling vehicle beside him. Montano took little interest in his rival's words as Aileron replied, "That is not what I said. It is no trouble at all. Lord Interfector brought up plenty of replenishments." Montano was still busy studying the chariot and barely heard the previous words until Aileron's last statement. "The decimated soldiers of your century at least should be replenished as soon as possible." There it was again. Why does this desk rider insist on belittling the actions of my forces, especially the forces on the east, the forces under Caesar? Montano thought as he noticed Aileron's signal for the pilot to step down, who did so after, putting the contraption into a halt. The engine whirred low and soft as Montano saw Aileron give the pilot a piece of paper. When the pilot walked towards the other broken vehicles to carry out some order, Montano turned away from the chariot and back to his rival. All he could think about is Aileron's obviously intentional means of irritating him. When Aileron felt the gaze of Montano long enough, he turned to the man who said, "Why are you even here, Aileron? From what it sounds like, there's a lot going on in your territory. Perhaps it's best you take your shiny uniform and see to assisting us on the front rather than speaking ill about my valiant forces." Aileron was honestly shocked at hearing this. Aileron was under the impression that they had reached some sort of mutual understanding with his offer to bolster Montano's century. All this prompted Aileron to respond. "Why the hostility? I never spoke ill of your unit. You said it yourself that the battle took its toll on your troops, and the decimation only furthered that. You also said that this front is moving fast, which means you don't have time to go all the way to Mesa Verde when Lord Interfector has legionaries for you right now." This apologetic clarification was something that Montano simply couldn't accept, especially since Aileron used that word decimation again. Montano remained true to his conviction and utterance. The provocative words he said were true, to him at least. Aileron was better suited away from Montano in the thick of the Colorado campaign. Unfortunately, Montano couldn't connect the fact that it was Caesar who ordered Aileron and his Primus to Denver, and wasn't just some chance for them to get out there. As the vehicle continued to softly whir next to them, Montano stayed true to his stance. "Perhaps you should move along. Leave these machines here for those who could actually use them." This statement bewildered Aileron again, who still couldn't quite grasp the reason Montano was escalating things. Aileron replied strictly, "I don't appreciate your tone when I had been nothing but cordial to you, Montano. These vehicles are to be used in the encirclement of Denver." Montano remembered being told not to, but he intentionally interrupted Aileron this time when he said, "Yes, Denver. A place where I'm going to fight, not just to drop off equipment." Aileron's blood was beginning to boil again. "I am not just dropping these off, I am to accompany Lord Interfector in the siege as well." Yes, directly alongside your Lanius or Carnifex. Under the advisory of Lord Interfector, perhaps valiant units such as yours will be prevented from suffering further unnecessary decimations. At that, Montano simply felt astounded that Aileron would actually use the word valiant in a mocking manner, and then finally end his statement with another intentional reminder of the 30 seconds decimation. Aileron knew full well that decimation was something done to entire cohorts, even for the actions of a lone sentry. It is unknown when exactly Aileron knew what he was doing, but in his words above, he did intentionally imply that Montano's unit was the one bearing the stain of cowardice. In an attempt to justify his position and take a jab at Montano, Aileron felt victorious until Montano's silence was explained. Wordlessly, Montano looked away from Aileron and took 2 steps before swinging his leg up on the chariot. As Montano took his place in the chariot's gun carriage, Aileron's brain struggled to process the act of silent defiance before him. Finally, Montano began fiddling with the controls, and Aileron ordered, still calm, "Leave that vehicle alone. You can't even pilot one of these." Montano, more focused on examining the controls, said, as if simply uninterested in Aileron's order, "Can't be too hard to figure out." Aileron's blood began to steam. "I order you to step down." The brand new charioteer looked up from the control box as he flipped the gear switch into drive. The engine let loose a howl, and Montano asked Aileron over the roar, "You order me?" Aileron's head began to steam, and his mind scrambled for words while fantasies about executing this worthless dog flashed through his mind. Before Aileron could say anything else, Montano's new ride jolted forward. The last 2 machines in the field sparked to life in an instant as well. Aileron saw red and lost complete control of his actions as he ripped Montano off the machine and began savagely assaulting him there in the mud. Punch after punch was delivered to Montano's head and face until Montano managed to pull his assailant off. The 2 wrestled in the mud, delivering intense blows to one another, with Aileron having the advantage by striking first. Finally, Aileron twisted the man's arms to a point that allowed him to take his spot back on top of Montano. In the maneuver, he found himself in a position where neither could move, but Aileron was at least in the position of victory. The 2 stopped everything, and Aileron in the winner's spot felt the presence in front of him. Figuring it was the engineers who were ready to assist, Aileron said through winded breaths, "Good, you're here. Now, arrest this insubordinate worm." Aileron was surprised when no reply came, and he wiped some of the mud from his eyes on his shoulder guard, only to briefly see a group of blood and dirt-covered legionaries before him. Still focused on the sneering and muddy face of his rival, the voice of Montano Sr. ordered more powerfully than Caesar himself, "Centurion Aileron, release my commander at once." Aileron didn't look up, but then he felt the weapons pointed at him, and the 2 men released their grips as Aileron stood. As he stood to his feet, Aileron glanced around and saw his staff was still nowhere to be seen, while the group of engineers stood by their machines unsure what to do about the whole thing. Montano dragged himself out of the mud with the assistance of Falco as the staff continued to train their guns on Aileron. Feeling completely betrayed by the whole world, Aileron stepped forward and screamed into the guns pointed at him. "You, Montano, should be killed." Still feeling those guns and glancing at the idle engineers, he whipped back to Montano and his staff. The sight disgusted Aileron, and he continued, I'll see you and the rest of your century crucified." Before Aileron could say anything else, Montano spat, "Then fucking do it, Aileron. Go petition Lanius about this incident when you reach Denver. See if Lanius doesn't kill you outright for wasting his fucking time. Your power in Circle Junction means nothing. To him, Caesar, or the forces in the meat grinder." Aileron stood stunned, but met the words head-on with pure Legion ferocity. It would be you who'd get his unit decimated. Ha! Fucking failure. How have you not been killed for cowardice already? Relying on your staff to save you? Immediately Montano screamed, almost too enraged to choose his words coherently. "You talking shit? Seriously? I love killing my own. You can't survive 6 seconds out here under Lanius. You and your pristine uniform and shit. Go tell Lord Interfector you'll go back where you belong. Playing supply bitch for us true servants of Caesar on the edge of glory." "Fuck you, Montano. I'll fucking kill you," Aileron shouted. his voice more resembling that of a demon than a person. Montano cackled maniacally. "You haven't killed anyone but defenseless slaves in how long?" "What? 11 years now? Ha ha!" It was almost too much. Aleron reached towards the SMG on his hip, but stopped himself when a flash of clarity showed those guns still pointing at him and remembered he was all alone in this somehow. He was too enraged to order assistance from the engineers, and even if he did, he knew what Montano would say to the plead for backup. Aleron intended to prove that he was more Legion than the wretch before him, and there were fewer ways of doing so than by storming headfirst against overwhelming odds that nearly ensured death. He would prove who was truly ready to leap from the edge of glory, but then he cut all his thoughts short. There, in the silence of a world where time had stopped, Aleron thought of the Interfector. If Aleron learned anything from years at the Interfector's side, it was that true service to Caesar was getting the job done to benefit the Legion. Aleron knew he was too important in his station to throw his life away against this thing that called itself Centurion Montano. Aleron had already let his feelings get the better of him when he assaulted the man. So, for the first time in his years of knowing Montano, he decided to stand down from a seemingly inevitable fight. Aleron halted his reach for the gun and let it hang as he instead wiped some more mud from his face. His uniform was ruined from its prior state, and he felt a bit of pride in this as he continued looking into the barrels of those guns. Aleron reached up and straightened his mud-stained helmet and looked back into the eyes of Montano as he said softly, "I have a job to do, Montano. Kaiser's orders to the Interfector, and I must be done." Still calm, Montano's shoulders were rising up and down with that little line of guns behind him as Aleron continued. "That said, you go fuck yourself and get your replenishments from Mesa Verde instead. I hope the 3 weeks of March cause enough of a delay to get you and the rest of your cowardly decimated unit killed. That would be the biggest service you could ever do for Lord Kaiser. You fucking failure." Montano was speechless, even as Aleron turned his back on the man to give the engineers a signal of some sort. One legionary ran to hop on Montano's abandoned ride, and the other 2 repaired vehicles began chugging towards the highway as well. Aleron took a few steps forward to join the gaggle of engineers, and Montano wouldn't have it. The words Aleron said were just about the most atrocious thing one legionary has ever said to another, then he just walked away. Montano was left to a very real and possible fate, a fate that he played a big part in creating, a fate that he would not tolerate. Aleron stopped in his tracks when Montano managed to sputter. He's talking about the 32nd as cowards when he's the one literally walking away? Ah, none of Montano's staff laughed. Instead, they just silently lowered their guns as Aleron continued his walk with the engineer group back to the main road. Who was at fault for this situation? Montano first? Aleron second? Montano third? These were the thoughts going through both men's minds. Montano was defeated from the physical standpoint in the end as he rejoined his diminished century to begin the march south. The man was resigned to the 3 weeks of marching and the equally long return trip before joining the siege of Denver. However, there was little he could do other than give the order of march. His 33 remaining men picked up their tent poles and supplies, where they began silently following their commander whose head was swarming with new thoughts and prayers that he'd stumble across another bolstering unit along the way. Aleron took the last verbal blow and continued to walk until he approached the head of the long column, where all the vehicles were rumbling behind him. Even after taking his place at the front, Aleron felt like the bigger man up until precisely 3.4 seconds after seeing Montano's column begin their march. As they approached, ready to pass the long column, the second Montano's face was close enough to detail Aleron felt like what he truly was, Centurion who walked away. Sure, he won the physical altercation, but he lost the honor battle astoundingly. Aleron tried not to let this get to him as he unconsciously walked to the lines of chariots under the guise of a standard check, but it wasn't working. Aleron's force was ready to go, standing on the old highway awaiting the order to march. While casually looking over the vehicles he was attempting to inspect, Aleron was more focused on Montano continuing to march south. They were almost about to reach the Interfector's staff and pass the chariots. Aleron almost vomited even at thought of what Montano would say in passing, and the original insult was continuing to eat him alive. Just as Montano's unit passed the Interfector's staff, Aleron could handle the insult and possibility of further insult no more. In an instant, Aileron lost complete control of his actions and didn't know what he was thinking as he took over the driver's spot on the nearest chariot. All he knew was that he was not a big enough man to back down from anything, no matter the task at hand. Regardless of who that insult was from, Aileron would not stand for such words that belittled his ability to advance the Legion, even if retribution meant diminishing that ability. Aileron took the controls of that chariot and gunned it right into Montano's column. 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Montano threw himself out of the way just in time, but felt the ram on the head of the chariot smash into his right foot before getting tossed into the mud. The 33 in his battle group were also largely spared from mortal injuries, but the act was clearly intentional. Montano picked himself up out of the mud as the unit continued to collect themselves. Upon putting some pressure on the foot, Montano feared possible dislocation, but that didn't stop rage and adrenaline from taking over when he saw the mud-covered Centurion helm operating that vehicle. Falco helped his Centurion out of the mud, but Montano continued looking at the vehicle wheeling around in the field. Fearing another pass, Montano ripped the spear out of Falco's hand and chucked it at the vehicle. After the incident, Aileron turned the chariot around, his mind swarming with thoughts about how to operate the machine, what he'd done, and regret about the whole thing. All those thoughts departed when he looked back at the highway and saw the spear sticking out of the vehicle's side. How Montano managed to lodge a spear into an armored steel chassis from nearly 100 yards away was beyond Aileron's understanding, but the act itself was signal enough for the true concern. Aileron yanked the spear right out of the vehicle's side and lobbed it right back. Montano felt the spear whip right past his head and found it wobbling in the spot where mud met road. Falco was about to ask his Centurion for calm and reason for focus on an objective, but he knew those traits never truly applied to Montano, whose viciousness in Colorado said all it needed to. There's no need for calm and reason when those things were so easily mutilated out of existence in a glorious display. There was not a person on Earth that could stop Montano from pulling that spear out of the asphalt and pulling the pilot off one of the Interfector's chariots. Before anyone in the Interfector's enormous column could react, Montano hopped on his own vehicle and clumsily sped towards his rival in the center of the field. Both men learned the controls as they went. Aileron jammed the propulsion pedal as Montano did the same. Aileron, without even knowing it was there, reached for a spear in a large quiver beside the control box, and just before passing, both men hurled spears at one another. Both had missed, but that wasn't nearly the end of it as they recovered from the pass and came to halt at the center of the field. Both drivers stopped their vehicles there in the open, each one facing the other with nearly 300 yards between. Before another charge, the two noticed the entire mass of soldiers gathered around the edge of the small plain. Other passing sentries of the Colorado meat grinder placed themselves at the edge of the field as well, wondering what the spectacle was while the other 12 vehicles rested on the road abandoned by their crews. What must have been nearly 2 full-strength cohorts worth of troops were gathered around the field, banners sticking up from the masses of red, and even the slaves in the crowd were completely captivated. Everyone Legion along that stretch of road were curious and captured by this display of defiance. Knowing in that strange telepathic way that whatever was going to happen was for Kaiser and the Legion in some twisted way, both men looked at each other from across the plain and knew there was no backing down now. Not that either duelist was intending to. Caesar himself likely couldn't stop the two men, and he probably wouldn't even want to since it was all for him. Before resuming their battle, the men noticed a pair of Centurions approaching from the mass of forces. They thought the Centurions might be there to arrest, but if that was the case, they likely wouldn't have been coming alone. The pair of Centurions split when they were halfway between the duelists, each one walking slowly towards one of the rivals. As Aileron's man got closer, he could see who it was. Centurion Taurus approached Aileron in the middle of the field and stopped not more than 10 yards away. With a Legion salute, Centurion Taurus called up at Aileron atop the loud chariot. "Centurion Aileron, will you give me the honor of acting as mediator for this engagement of mutual combat?" Aileron was briefly amazed that the words from Taurus weren't a plea to see clearly and resume the march. Too lost in the why, Aileron's mouth answered for his heart when his brain wasn't able. "This engagement needs no mediation. I will see to this insubordinate creature's end on behalf of the Legion. Centurion Taurus replied with another salute. Understood, Centurion Aileron, and began walking back to the congregated mass. At the exact same time, Centurion Montano couldn't identify the commander who stopped before him. The unknown officer shouted up at Montano over the roar of the engine with a salute. Centurion Montano, I hope you deem the supplies I requisitioned to your senior as satisfactory? Montano met the eyes of the officer, and it clicked. You must be Centurion Sereno. And yes, I intend to pay you back in full as soon as I deal with this pathetic excuse for a Legion commander. Centurion Sereno of the 59th replied. No need. I only ask that you allow me the honor of mediating this engagement with Centurion Aileron. Montano briefly wondered how Serrano knew that Aileron was on the vehicle across the field, having almost completely forgotten that he himself was the subject of a story told around Legion camps. Montano never even met Centurion Sereno before this moment, but who else would be the man that Falco's commander would engage in such a setting? Lost in his thoughts, Montano only replied, This engagement needs no mediation. I will see to the execution of this self-important waste of space on behalf of Caesar. Sereno gave another salute and replied to Montano, Very good, Centurion Montano. Both Taurus and Sereno walked back to the mass of crimson soldiers beside the highway and met in the middle, discussing the particulars of how they would act in possible scenarios that may transpire in such a unique fight. The two stopped about 30 paces from the rest of the enormous crowd and did an about-face to act as mediators and give some form of impromptu legitimacy for the event. Both officers had told the other what was said in their brief interactions with the duelists and briefly marveled how they use almost the same words. What especially stood out to the mediators was how both duelists said that this was an official act on behalf of Caesar or the Legion. Under normal circumstances, fabricating an order on behalf of Caesar was an action worthy of execution. The same could also be said about fabricating orders on behalf of the Legion without approval from Caesar, or someone like a legate or elite. Taurus was certain that Aileron was not given any orders with the elite or Caesar's approval for the chariot-based killing of Montano. Sereno, too, was almost entirely certain that Caesar did not authorize the execution of Aileron, especially in this vehicular fashion. However, both acting mediators came to the same silent conclusion that this was just part of the act. Both mediating officers had heard the same story as every other masked face in the sea of red and black behind them, and both knew one of the rivals somewhat personally, if not by some procedural relationship. Still, despite being too Legion to show it, both officers were excited to watch a legend play out before their eyes and allowed the order fabrications to go unreprimanded or unreported. With plenty of reputable witnesses in the crowd behind them, the co-mediators raised their blades, and the duelists gunned it towards the other before the blades could fall. The wind picked up as the two vehicles sped towards each other, but not even the wind could prevent their spears from being hurled at a nearly impossible velocity as they made their pass. Both spears had missed again, and the charioteers only knew this when they were far enough away and the black smoke had cleared. Both men were furious that the other still stood, and the two whipped their war carts around to make ready for another pass. The whole field was filtered in a black haze as the two vehicles skidded in the mud to orient themselves for charge, and the roaring engines continued to pour their black smoke into the air. As both drivers skidded into place, one would never have guessed that the men didn't have years of vehicle operating experience under their singlet. The mass of Legion forces was almost silent as the grave, while each masked soldier watched the scene. Many of the slaves believing this fight was some sort of demonstration for what Caesar's machines were capable of. Most veterans and centurions in the mass knew firsthand why this was happening, since some had seen the two wrestling in the mud barely 30 minutes prior, and although they were all too disciplined to cheer, many began stomping in place after the first official pass. The action spread until the entire stationary mass beside that stretch of highway sounded like a terrifying march, creeping closer and closer to a glorious, blood-spattered and savage end for all Caesar's opposition. The duelists facing each other, both men looked to the enormous crowd of witnesses and heard that marching sound before it was all buried under another scream of the engines as they charged once more. As the two charged one another, the field quickly became even more clouded in smoke, with the large wheels of each contraption tearing up the grass and spraying mud in every direction. Visibility was almost completely gone for both men before hurling their spears once again. Montano couldn't see it coming, but Aileron's spear flew out of the smoke and clipped Montano in the neck. While Aileron couldn't see his minor victory, he knew he'd made some success when a burst from Montano's SMG came from the smoke. The action made Aileron return with his own long spray of bullets, but the two continued their pass and made another turn and halt on opposite sides of the field. As the smoke cleared and the vehicles rumbled in a halt, they assessed the damage. Aileron noticed a brand new dent in his shoulder guards where one of Montano's bullets pelted the thick steel. The small hole showed his shoulder was just barely spared, and the lack of an exit hole gave meaning to the hot loose object bouncing around in the hollow space beneath his pauldron. Aileron's vehicle, on the other hand, took the most damage. Aileron heard the engine continue chugging and sputtering, but he could see hydraulic fluid or some sort of oil spraying out from somewhere under the front right wheel well. The haze had cleared just enough for Aileron to see Montano reloading his submachine gun, and Aileron went to reach for his ammo satchel when he noticed something unique. Montano peered through the smoke as best he could to see the damage he'd done to Aileron, but his attention was quickly brought to his neck. He raised his hand and felt his neck. Upon inspection, his hand came out very red. As red as it was, it didn't appear to have severed the artery, but tracing the wound with his blackened fingers showed a slim chunk of his neck was taken away by Aileron's spear. Taking a quick inventory, he noticed his vehicle and person was largely spared Aileron's return fire, but then he adjusted in place and noticed the pain in his foot from earlier. Surmising it was an ankle dislocation based on the site of pain, and figuring his neck could be bandaged off later, he figured he could fix at least one of his problems without his rival noticing any supposed success. Montano stomped his dislocated foot on the floor of the chariot. The ankle bone popped back in place, and he laughed hysterically at the pain beneath the engine noise. Head back in the game, Montano reloaded his weapon very overtly to show his enemy he was ready for more, but to his surprise, Aileron had managed to detach something from the side of his vehicle, a long pole of some sort. Aileron lifted up the heavy instrument off a mount on the left side of the chariot. Taking it off the rack, he wrapped his hands around the oxygen tanks, saw the gauges, and cackled to himself as he realized what he'd found. Being no stranger to the steelworks of Circle Junction, and more importantly, how to incinerate Kaiser's enemies with old-world tools, he ignited the end of the long thermic lance and looked deep into Montano's eyes from across the field. Montano couldn't look long at the brightest thing in 100 miles. He immediately looked and found his own long thermic lance on the side of his chariot, and too knew how to ignite the thing from experience. With smaller versions of this industrial monstrosity, the mass had to look away when the lances were ignited, for they were the brightest thing in any direction. These balls of rock melting fire at the end of their 10-foot poles were made even brighter in the black haze and overcast landscape along the highway. With both men ready for their ends, the two locked eyes passed their miniature suns sparking at 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit and screamed into the wind as their engines roared. Their chariots launched them towards each other at over 40 miles per hour, and smoke shrouded the landscape once more, while the balls of fire got closer and closer to one another. The lancers immediately lost their ability to aim in the flurry of smoke, and both men watched in awe as the balls of fire approached through the cloud. With one last scream for their honor, the suns had landed where destiny decided, and the duel ended. Aileron lost grip on his lance the millisecond he felt the impact. The Interfector's second shifted himself just in time to save his life, but Montano's thermic weapon slid its way across Aileron's left pec to his right shoulder, melting the steel of his armor like nothing, and instantly cooling in the Colorado cold. Aileron was thrown from his chariot, his upper armor almost completely melted to a new shape around his right shoulder. With Aileron embracing the pain of those third-degree burns across his upper torso, he laid there in the mud in agony, surrounded by the cloud of black smoke with Montano's lance lying a few feet away, melting the earth around it. Montano felt the lance get pulled from his hand, something he took as a sign of victory in the cloud of smoke. Although he couldn't recall what happened to Aileron's weapon since he was so focused on aiming his own through the blinding light and blackness. Montano couldn't think about this long because a second later, his vehicle burst through the smoke, and before looking back to try and see his victory, he noticed Aileron's lance sticking out the front of his chariot's pilot carriage. In an instant, Montano felt the heat and looked down to see Aileron's lance incinerating and melting its way through his control box. In a panic, Montano jammed on the brakes, tried switching gears and steering, but it was no use as the control box was sparking and hissing and rapidly becoming a lump of molten metal. Montano saw the thick woods around the field getting closer and closer, and his vehicle was stuck speeding at 40 miles per hour. Knowing he was stuck on a speeding machine he had no control over, his final resolution was to look back and try to see if he'd at least be meeting Aileron in hell through the smoke cloud in the center of the plane. Montano unfortunately could not tell before everything went black. Some say Montano's vehicle slammed into a tree and sent him into another. Some say Montano was knocked unconscious on collision when he was thrown into the barbed wire netting above his chariot. Either way, Montano did not die, and neither did Aileron. Everyone there saw Montano's chariot get wrecked at the edge of the woods and saw Aileron's vehicle slow to a halt just beyond the smoke cloud, without a rider. By the time of Montano's wreck, the cloud had cleared enough to show Aileron lying in the field beside Montano's sparking weapon, and many soldiers ran to each duelist. Upon finding both duelists still breathing, the only thing that needed to be known was that both had won, but both had lost yet again. 3 days later, Aileron sat there in the personal tent of Lord Interfector, awaiting his return from that brief errand. Aileron had spent the past 2 other nights in there as well, after passing the outpost at Fairplay, and the man shifted uncomfortably. He was rather used to sharing a tent with Lord Interfector during the march to Denver, and even over the years during their semi-frequent tours around the Praetor's territory. It should come as no surprise that this recent uneasiness was due to the chariot duel 3 days earlier. He remembered hearing about a collision, but Aileron unfortunately fell out of consciousness shortly before and couldn't see past Montano's weapon as he laid there in the mud. His injuries, though still very painful even 3 days later, allowed him to regain consciousness only an hour or 2 after the duel. All he truly remembered after getting thrown from the chariot was the moment he awoke. He wished he'd remained unconscious because he remembered waking up when a couple armorers from a nearby sentry were prying off his armor. When Montano's weapon landed, it essentially melted his armor to better fit his shoulder. Being almost impossible to take off, the armorers thought it might be best to keep his shoulder part steel, since that seemed the more legendary solution. In the end, it was decided against, and Aileron awoke in the middle of them reheating the armor to better remove it. Even at this time, the pain of the injury and crude treatment remained. Though Aileron didn't know it, Taurus had resumed the march while he was out shortly after getting the other vehicle operational again. By the time the thermic lances came out, Taurus realized that his and Sereno's roles as mediators were futile, and so he dispatched a runner to relay word of what was happening to the Interfector. The runner was already a mile up the road when Montano's vehicle was destroyed. With the site of the duel being less than a full day's march from Fairplay, the Interfector wouldn't take long to return to the large battle group already marching under Taurus after the incident. So, it was that evening that Aileron awoke again on the back of a different chariot and met with the Interfector, who'd made the run from the meeting with Caesar at Fairplay almost immediately upon hearing the news. To Aileron's surprise, the Interfector didn't say anything other than, "Good, you're awake," that night. So 2 days and 2 nights later, Aileron had continued to walk directly behind the Interfector, who remained silent for almost the whole time, even when they encamped. Aileron was given basic instructions or orders to carry out during each encampment, but it was on that second day when Aileron learned that there was a new sentry that had joined the Interfector's bolstering cohort. To little surprise, it was Montano's 32nd century, completely replenished with soldiers from the Interfector's force. Then, it was on that second night of encampment that Aileron counted the chariots. 13 out of the original 14 remained. And Aileron knew that number was due to what happened to Montano's chariot, a destruction of Caesar's greatest machinery that he himself was responsible for. So, the march went on. Denver got closer, and Aileron thought a lot about the condition of Montano, but didn't have to think about it long since idle conversation from off-duty legionaries said he was still alive. Aileron did not wish to know much more than that, and didn't even have an opinion on the matter. Aileron instead was more focused on the lack of words from his commander and friend. He simply couldn't tell if the Interfector just had a lot on his mind, or if he was angry about the duel. The Interfector didn't shine any light on either. The questions about Montano burned in Aileron's mind despite not even knowing whether or not he had yet to awake from the fight. And the Interfector remained something of a mystery to Aileron regardless of how long he'd known the man. At the end of each day, Aileron would lay down to sleep after a rough march in his condition, and then consider the question of what was to happen to both he and Montano. He thought back to the Gold Canyon whipping post all those years ago, the mercy extended to him at first, and then the feel of that whip in front of the Jones, and wondered. What was to come of this? Aileron hadn't been harmed for disciplinary infractions in so long, and he doubted Montano had as well. Both men were centurions, and outside of tremendous battlefield failure, centurions of the Legion were so rarely punished. Would an incident, like the chariot fight, be brought before Caesar himself for punishment? Would both he and Montano be crucified for their conduct? Or, Aileron had not truly expected this, but would it be possible that both he and Montano would perhaps be rewarded for their courage? The latter was doubtful, but stranger things have happened that ultimately resulted in Caesar being pleased. Aileron recalled all of this and speculated so much more as he sat there in the Interfector's tent on the morning of that third day. Outside the standard encampment duties he was instructed to carry out, that morning the Interfector gave Aileron the first unexpected directive since the duel: "Wait here till I return." Many minutes passed, and Aileron was still waiting patiently as he heard the pack-up going on outside the tent. Finally, the Interfector returned, ducking under the opening while Aileron was in the middle of thinking about Montano. Aileron stood to the attention upon his commander's entry and gave his "hail" as the elite silently motioned for Aileron to sit back down. Aileron did so, and the Interfector removed his long wolf coat from over his shoulders and warmed his hands by a lit torch as he glanced at his second with a soft grin. "I'm certain you'll be happy to know that Montano just awoke this morning." Aileron noticed this grin was the first facial expression he'd seen on his Primus since the duel before Aileron returned. "Excellent news to hear, my lord." The Interfector almost chuckled as he looked back into the flame, saying idly, "Tell me how you really feel." Aileron was about to convey his internal disposition on the subject of Montano's recent awakening, when the Interfector added the answer to what Aileron was thinking about prior to the sarcastic directive. Montano suffered 2 fractures in his left leg and 1 in his right. The only thing that saved his life after a head injury like that was his helmet, and his ribs are. The duelist momentarily felt rather proud in what he'd done to the man until he recalled that the machine did most of it on collision, something that stole some of the glory from his victory. He attempted to regather some of that glory when he considered that it was his weapon that destroyed the machine. Before he could reobtain that pride, he remembered again that his victory destroyed a nearly irreplaceable piece of Legion equipment. Aileron just sat there and listened to the few other injuries Montano sustained, and despite how bad they were, everything the elite was saying sounded like they weren't enough to send him to the Recuperatio Unitatis. The man briefly recalled his own tremendous pain where Montano's lance melted its way across his chest and shoulder, and really heard the last part of the Interfector's status report. Montano vowed to be upwardly mobile by the time we reached Denver. Aha, a new way to best that man, Aileron thought as he internally vowed to overcome his melted chest and shoulders pain before reaching Denver. As soon as he realized the elite was looking at him again, he noticed a little more of the man's return to his usual self. Aileron truly wondered why the elite was seemingly fine with the whole thing, and thought once more about the kinds of punishments he felt were due. The Interfector could see this thought battle in Aileron's mind, and prompted with the motion of a hand for Aileron to respond. Aileron asked, almost confused, "What's to come of the incident?" The elite met Aileron's eyes again for a moment, as he asked, "Sorry, the duel, my Primus. How are Montano and I to be punished?" asked the duelist. The Interfector looked back at Aileron and stayed there for a long silent moment before finally answering, "You aren't. Neither of you." Aileron was instantly shocked to hear that, but then he saw the grin on the Interfector's face once more, and something clicked in his mind. He had spent so many years beside the Interfector, but realized in that moment how little of him he actually knew. Despite all the titles and responsibilities the Interfector was in charge of, Aileron never actually knew the man so much as the commander. The elite let his personality and principles seep out of his centurion's garb, and Aileron had no idea what to even make of that for so long. The duelist was long past the days of punishment in the style he'd grown up knowing about that he realized in that moment he had a friend. in his commander. Still, there was something else that was pressing, but the idea of what he was to the Interfector cemented itself after Aileron managed to croak out. So my Primus is not mad about the chariot ordeal. As Aileron wondered what that something else was about the Interfector, the elite replied with another soft grin as he looked back into the fire. Nope. If anything, I should thank you for that, since it gave me a reason to leave that meeting with Caesar. Aileron contemplated the meaning of the Interfector's words in general before he went on. You and Montano's little battle got me out of one of the most uncomfortable meetings I've ever had with him. There was talk about diverting our force to the eastern border to prepare for a possible offensive into Brotherhood territory. I know he'll come to understand that Denver must be destroyed first, but the losses on this front are almost already too much for the moment, without opening up yet another conflict without a breather. It was best that I was called away. Might have even saved the Legion if I wasn't there to answer any more questions about the status of our reserve pools. That number is not who's available in the territories, it's who's left in it. Aileron again continued wondering the meaning of the words he was hearing, and how to understand them in a way that would lead to future Legion victories when the Interfector said it. Just because we're on a winning streak, that doesn't mean it will stay that way, especially within these styles of victory. He met Aileron's eyes once more and added, Caesar is a smart man, so I'm sure he understands that, but it's easy for victory and success to cloud someone's judgment or rid them of caution. That's what men like you and I are for, though, right, Aileron? The elite saw Aileron break from his concentration. Aileron then agreed with his commander and friend, still chewing on those words as he said, of course, Primus. May I ask what this means for the present? The Interfector saw the light in Aileron's eyes, knowing some of his own actions and outlooks were finally beginning to blossom in the mind of his subordinate. The elite answered the question plainly, catching his own glimpse of an unknown spirit in Aileron's eye before the words left. What this means is that we continue the march. Denver and these hangdogs will fall in a matter of weeks. Where Caesar wants to go next will have to wait until afterward. Caesar will triumph, but you and I will carry out one order at a time. He paused, trying to better figure out that look behind Aileron's eye. He thought he'd found it before resuming. So, our force would join this Lanius or Carnifex in Denver, lay siege for however long it takes to win in a decisive manner. And hopefully forces in the meat grinder come to understand that getting your entire force destroyed doesn't bring honor to Caesar, it throws the Legion's future in the dumpster. I don't know if you heard, by the way, but I replenished Montano's unit. We're going to need veteran commanders like him, familiar with siege work construction. At that, the elite understood the question and spirit in Aileron's mind. It was the fire of two conflicting ideas. The idea of Caesar's victories versus the Legion's future. A struggle personified by Montano, a man seeming to stand against the Legion future in favor of the other, Aileron, believing he was finally coming to understand the motives and actions of the Interfector. Couldn't understand why his Primus would assist a man like that, who apparently stands in the way of the future that the murderer of Phoenix stood for. My lord, I fail to understand the reason you would aid that man who continuously dishonors your position and subsequently mine. A man willing to throw away the Legion's future, as you say, by wasteful tactics, and Aileron was cut short by another raise of the Interfector's hand, standing there silently for a long moment. The Interfector could see what he'd always seen in Aileron's soul, pure dedication to the thing he himself stood for. Though Aileron didn't know it, Aileron was always dedicated to the Legion itself rather than Caesar directly, and the elite wondered if that was why he took a shine to the fanatic in the first place. Aileron was the most procedure and detail-oriented soldier he'd ever known, in a nation and army that was moving more and more towards the savage victories that unwittingly put Caesar's creation in jeopardy. The elite could see that Aileron's supreme dedication to his unknown disposition manifested in conflict with Montano, who seemed to embody the contrary of that devout soul. In the silence, the Interfector knew that they were all Legion, and briefly marveled at how it was possible for two minds to take different paths of thought, when every masked soldier was so focused on a singular, but dual idea, Caesar's Legion. Subtle deviations in thought turned out to not be so subtle when it created situations like the perpetual duels of Aileron and Montano. This idea of two similar but very different minds reminded the elite of a philosophy he'd recently heard from the emperor they all bowed to. After so long in thought, the Interfector spoke to his subordinate. I heard a unique idea from Lord Caesar about something called Hegelian dialectics, thesis, and antithesis. Victory in the present is needed, even for that future people like me and Graham have in mind. With the simultaneous Colorado campaign and Brotherhood campaign, on the verge of turning everything Caesar created into a nomadic warband, it is only inevitable that the Legion's victories and the Legion's future meet and synthesize into something new. It is hopeful that this something new is what enables that reunion with the West he so desires. The elite saw the look on Aleron's face, who had no idea what the West was, but the Interfector realized he was on the verge of disclosing information he was not authorized to share. In effort to clarify the reason that all soldiers under the Bull must cooperate in this period of Caesar's reign, he was about to share more than he was allowed to, more than he knew, more than he could say without delivering possible falsehoods. In the end, the elite decided that perhaps it was best that things didn't need to be explained. With the two about to exchange types of consciousness, the Interfector decided it was best to maintain focus on the present, especially when Caesar was the only one who volunteered to be burdened by contemplation about the future's particulars. Finally, the elite said, "One step at a time, Aleron. All that needs to be said is that the Legion is at the height of power, and though a fall of any type is nowhere in sight, commanders like you and Montano are more than needed. I expect peace from both you and him when we reach Denver. There are plenty of profligate tribals that need destruction. Wherever the post-Denver synthesis leads us, I can assure you there will be no shortage of wars and battles." Aleron gave a silent nod, accepting the will of his commander as the elite concluded. "I should mention lastly, since I'm certain there's nothing I can do to prevent you and Montano from fighting again in some way or another, aside from death. I'll tell you very kindly what I told Montano 20 minutes ago. Do not destroy Legion equipment like that again, or I'll chain you both to chariots and have them drive in opposite directions. Denver will fall, but further damage to Caesar's and Legion equipment will result in your ripping in half. Does that sound fair?" "Of course, my Primus," replied Aleron to his commander and friend's serious statement. The elite widened the soft grin on his face and patted Aleron's leg. The two stood and emerged from the tent to better oversee the camp's pack up. An hour later, Aleron took his place behind the Interfector who ordered the march, and Montano chuckled to himself from the back of the Interfector's assigned chariot. The smoke cloud on the horizon marked the soon-to-be-destroyed city of Denver and inched closer and closer as the minutes turned into hours.